Hi YouTube! I'm pretty sure that in just about every video I have ever posted on this channel, I have used the phrase, and then I'm going to put so-and-so into my pressure pot. I also get asked all the time about what steps I take to mitigate air bubbles in my dice. So today, we are going to two birds, one stone this subject and talk all about pressure pots. What they are, why I use them, the different parts of a pressure pot, things that are not a pressure pot, that people seem to think are a pressure pot for some reason, and finally, a couple of thoughts about whether you or a resin caster you know may want to eventually invest in and use a pressure pot as well. Let's get into it. One of the tricky things when talking about pressure pots is that they can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and very few of them are actually made and marketed as pressure pots. A lot of them are DIY converted. So to begin, let me show you two very different pressure pots. For example, this is a pressure pot covered in stickers, but it's a pressure pot. So is this, and I'm not going to be able to lift this one that high. This, oh my gosh, is also a pressure pot. Not covered in stickers yet, but a pressure pot. So this small pot that I showed you first, that I can lift up, is not made or marketed as a pressure pot. That is a Harbor Freight paint pot that was converted into a pressure pot. And this is maybe the most common and popular way for dice makers to get their hands on a pressure pot. How it was DIY'd is a whole different video and topic, and also I didn't do it myself, my dad did it, so I really don't have much knowledge there, but there are tons of videos converting Harbor Freight paint pots into pressure pots. Again, by far, in my experience, these are the most common pressure pots being used. Whereas that large pressure pot I showed you is actually made and marketed as a pressure pot. It is the California Air Tools brand 5-gallon pressure pot for casting. So there's a lot of difference between a 2.5-gallon Harbor Freight paint pot that is converted to work as a pressure pot versus a 5-gallon California Air Tools pressure pot that is made and marketed that way. And I've even heard of people using like tennis ball pressurizers as a miniature form of a pressure pot to do the same thing. But what is the thing that it does? Why the heck am I talking about pressure pots so much? What is the point? Why do we use them? Speaking from the dice maker perspective, we use pressure pots to mitigate or eliminate air bubbles. If you've worked with resin before, you know that it can get filled with a bunch of tiny little micro air bubbles, and this is especially problematic with dice. But pressure pots are just a canister that is meant to hold a pretty significant amount of pressure via pressurized air. So as the pressurized air goes in, any bubbles left in that resin get squished until they are so microscopic that they are insignificant. And thus you get smooth, lovely, bubble-free dice. So I'll show you the difference between dice that are cast in a pressure pot and have no visible air bubbles versus a die that I forgot, I think, to cast in the pressure pot and is littered with bubbles. So trypophobia warning. If you have trypophobia, if you don't like bubbles or little holes, you need to look away from the screen. I'll tell you when you can come back. Look away, it's gonna bother you. Don't look at this. First, let me show you what some dice that are cast in a pressure pot looks like. This blank was totally clear and then cast again in clear resin, so if there were any micro bubbles, you'd be able to see them. I cast my dice at between 20 and 40 psi, and that seems to do the trick. As you can see, these dice are totally bubble-free. Even if the design is matte, this is a failed design, so don't pay attention to that, but even if the design is matte, you'll be able to tell there are no micro bubbles. Whereas in this D20, what I'm trying to show, and it might be a little tricky to see, is it is riddled with a bunch of teeny tiny micro bubbles inside. You can see two larger bubbles through that foreface, but if you look at all of those dots that look like glitter, they're bubbles. Now, the bubbles on this D20 are much easier to see. This D20, the blank I cast in my pressure pot, but when I did the second casting for the shell with the numbers, I forgot to put it in my pressure pot, and this is the result.
Every single face of the die is riddled with surface bubbles. The numbers are pretty much illegible and completely destroyed from the bubbles. The only way you could recover this die is to peel away all of that resin and try to redo the blank, but this die is just ruined.
Okay, my trypophobics, you can come back. Come back to me now. It is off the screen. You are safe and sound. But as you can see, if you saw it, yikes, huh? Dice that are not cast in a pressure pot can end up absolutely riddled and covered with bubbles. And obviously, you're not gonna sell that. It is important to mention, however, that this is not a 100% bubble-free guarantee. Resin is a little more finicky than that. You still might end up with some air bubbles, especially if you're working with like florals or moss or lots of Angelina fiber, basically materials where bubbles will get caught in different recesses. The pressure pot may not eliminate every single bubble, but it sure does a lot. It's very, very close to 100%, and it is incredibly reliable and useful. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, this is really important for dice molds specifically, right? Unlike a lot of resin casting you may see, I know like coasters are really, really popular. You will see people who make those just degassing them with a heat gun or a little flame over the top of the surface, and that can work completely fine. But dice molds are different, right? They are a 3D object completely encased in a mold. They have the indents for numbers on every single side. D20s have 20 sides, 20 points, 20 numbers, a whole bunch of holes and cavities, and you can't manually degas that, right? You need a lid on to make it a 3D object, so you can't let bubbles naturally rise through the resin and eliminate them easily that way. You have to find some other methods to work to mitigate those bubbles, and again, pressure pots are pretty much the most consistent and reliable method out there. Now that we've discussed what a pressure pot is and why I use it for dice making, we can take a look at the parts that enable it to function. Let's grab our tiny again. Up it comes. So, parts of a pressure pot. We're doing it this way. Canister. This is just the base canister. Ta-da! That everything is held in. And everything else is in the lid itself. So we're gonna take it off. Okay, I've moved you down a bit, and I'm a little bit of a liar. I'm not a liar. I just was wrong. So, this is the base canister, and it does have one more part, which is these clamps. These clamps clamp the lid down, right? You have your base, you have your twisty clamps, and then inside of mine, you have a piece of wood covered in way too much excess resin that's probably going to be impossible to get out of here. But it is just, again, a canister with an inside and some clamps to hold the lid down. And then we have our lid. Here's the bottom side. Not too interesting. There is a gasket in here. Important, keeps a good seal. And then we just have a few parts that make the pressure pot. It is not a very complicated device. We have our pressure gauge. This shows us how many PSI, pressure per square inch, is in the device. This knob maximizes or minimizes the amount of pressure, so you could set this to pressurize to 40 and then stop. You could set it pressurized to 20 and then stop there, or you could set it really high and just manually stop it wherever you want. You also have an inlet valve. This is what we plug our air compressor into. Some people use a dice pump, a bike pump. Some people use a bike pump. That sounds like a lot of work. A lot of people use an air compressor. This valve opens and closes. So if you plug it in with this valve this way, nothing will happen. You open it, air starts to flow in through the inlet valve. This is our outlet valve. Air comes out here from the back. As long as this is down, air exits. When this is up, air stays in. That's the lid of the pressure pot. Again, not a super complicated device. You have inlet, outlet, gauge, pressure pot. Now that we understand what parts make up a pressure pot and what it does, I have to talk about two things that are not a pressure pot. One that is not and will not work for any resin casting. One that is not a pressure pot but does have a similar functionality. First of all, you cannot use a pressure cooker instead of a pressure pot. That second word, cooker, is a problem. We don't want to cook our resin. The whole point of a pressure pot is all you're getting is pressurized air. Pressure cookers come with heat. We don't want that. You cannot and should not. Please do not use a pressure cooker in the place of a pressure pot. A wee bit less concerning is a vacuum chamber. For some reason, vacuum chambers and pressure pots somewhere along the line a few years ago got mixed up, and it's not really a lot of people's fault because I've seen Amazon listings where it'll say a bunch where it's like vacuum chamber, this watt, vacuum chamber, pressure pot, vacuum chamber. It's not a pressure pot. However, vacuum chambers work for a similar purpose in kind of the opposite way. A vacuum chamber is pulling air bubbles up and out until it creates a vacuum. You can use a vacuum chamber for your resin or silicone, you just don't cure it in it, right? If you're using a vacuum chamber for resin or silicone, you'll do it when you're mixing your resin and silicone. Once it's all fully mixed, you can place those cups, hopefully with a lot of extra room in the cups, into a vacuum chamber, seal it, start the vacuum, and you will watch your resin and silicone bubble up like crazy, filling the entire cup. If you don't have a big enough cup, it will overflow, so have a lot of extra space, and then eventually it'll kind of settle. And this is also pulling air bubbles out of resin and silicone. It's just happening at a different point in the process. This can be really, really, really good for silicone casting. Resin casting in dice molds, it's still a little iffy because of all the numbers and cavities and the way dice molds are sealed. Even though you're pulling the bubbles out beforehand, you might still end up with bubbles developing during the pour itself. But again, still a totally valid and great way to degas or pull air bubbles out of silicone and resin. It's just not the same as a pressure pot, and they don't work the same way. But all of that being said, do you need a pressure pot? Who needs a pressure pot and who doesn't? Well, obviously it's always going to come down to personal opinion and preference, but this is my opinion on the subject. I think that if you are a hobbyist or an aspiring hobbyist or someone who just likes to craft and try things out and have fun, you just want to make a die or two, a set or two, just try things out, of course you don't need a pressure pot. You do not need a pressure pot just to try things out and get started with dice making or any resin casting. There are a lot of steps that you can take to degas resin throughout the process. That is not a pressure pot. Does that ultimately require a little bit more work? Is it a little harder? Are you likely to end up with more internal and surface bubbles? Sure, but you're just starting out and you're just doing it for fun and you're not trying to make a job or a career or a name of yourself. So what? As long as you're having fun, you're learning, and you like what you're producing, then of course you don't need to change it up. To the contrary, if you've been making dice for a while and you want to elevate the quality of those dice, you're tired of taking those degassing steps and you want less work during the process of casting itself to get rid of bubbles. Maybe you've been fighting the bubbles for a while and you're unhappy with what you've been producing because of bubbles, or you are an aspiring professional who wants to make and sell your dice either as a little side hustle or eventually as a full-time job. Then you're probably going to want to start looking into investing in a pressure pot. It is a really, really helpful tool. I think every single dice maker I know who makes and sells their dice and has been doing so for more than 6 months eventually gets themselves a pressure pot. And I think just about all of us would say that if that is who you are, right? You're not just doing this for fun. You're not just doing this as a hobby, but you're liking it, you want to elevate your quality and maybe even eventually start producing and selling more of your dice, then I would recommend it. I think pressure pots are an incredible tool and they will just add so much ease and soundness of mind to your dice making process. Ultimately, a pressure pot is just a device that holds pressurized air, which I as a dice maker use to mitigate as many bubbles as I possibly can in my dice designs. You don't need a pressure pot, especially if you're just a newcomer or a hobbyist. But if you are looking for an easier way to mitigate bubbles in your dice, then I think a pressure pot is a really, really worthwhile investment. And that is all I have for today's video. So if you liked it, consider dropping me a like down below or leaving a comment saying hi. I get pretty lonely. Otherwise, as always, I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one, which won't take 3 months this time, I promise, and I'm sorry. That was my bad. Bye-bye!